Hello, 7th grade. So we are going to start looking at some geometry. So the next few weeks are going to look like, we're going to go over some things that I want you to at least see in geometry. And then we're going to do a little project with geometry, and that will take place at home. If you remember before Christmas, we did the 3D. We talked about some 3D shapes and whatnot. So this time our focus is going to be on two-dimensional things. So we're going to start with the basics. And the first thing that we're going to talk about are classifying angles. So what I've done for you for this week is I've broken this into two sections. So video 1 is going to focus on name and identify angles. And video 2 is going to focus on finding a missing measure. Okay, so this is video 1. We are going to work on name and identify angles. All right, so some vocabulary for you. You see here I have highlighted vertical, congruent, and adjacent. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I broke it into 3 sections. I gave it to you in words, I showed you a model, and then I wrote it out in symbols. Okay, so we're going to go over that together. So first thing, 2 angles are vertical if they are opposite angles formed by the intersection of 2 lines. So here we have 2 lines, and we can see that they intersect. Okay, that intersect means that's where they cross. I have labeled the angles 1, 2, 3, and 4. So vertical angles are opposite angles. So that means that they are across from one another. So if we look here, we are going to name our vertical angles. So if I look at angle 1, the angle opposite to angle 1 or across from it is angle 3. So angle 1 and angle 3 are vertical. Now, this little symbol that I wrote in front of the number, that means angle. So angle 1 and angle 3 are vertical angles. Now, I have angle 2. Well, across from angle 2, I have angle 4. So angle 2 and angle 4 are vertical angles. So again, I used my symbol for angle and I wrote that angle 2 and angle 4 are vertical angles. Now, something that you need to know about vertical angles is that vertical angles are congruent. And when 2 things are congruent, that means that they're the same shape and the same size. So since vertical angles are congruent, that means that these angle measures are the same. So if we look over here under symbols, I have angle 1. This symbol right here means congruent. And remember that congruent means that they have the same measure. So angle 1 and angle 3 are congruent, so they have the same angle measure. And angle 2 and angle 4 are congruent, so that means that they have the same angle measure. Okay? So vertical angles are across from one another or opposite from one another, and vertical angles are congruent, which means they have the same angle measures. So the other type of angle that we're going to talk about are adjacent angles. And if something is adjacent, that means that it's side by side. So 2 angles are adjacent if they share a common vertex, a common side, and do not overlap. So if we look at the example here, I have angle 1, 2, 3, and 4. So adjacent angles, they're going to share a vertex, and the vertex is the intersection. That's where the lines intersect. So this point right here is my vertex. So they share a common vertex, a common side, and do not overlap. So if we look here, I have angle 1. Well, angle 1 and angle 2 are adjacent because they are side by side. They share a common vertex, this vertex here. They share a side and they do not overlap. So angle 1 and angle 2 are adjacent. Angle 2 and angle 3 are adjacent. They share the same vertex. They share a common side. They do not overlap. Angle 3 and angle 4 are also adjacent, as well as angle 4 and angle 1. So over here you will see that I have listed all of the adjacent angles. I put the symbol in front and the angle that it was adjacent to. So remember that adjacent means they share a common vertex, a common side, and they do not overlap. Or, if it helps you, to remember, adjacent angles are side by side. Okay. And we're going to talk about how we can name an angle by its vertex and by its points. Okay? Alrighty. Alright, so now we're going to look at some examples of naming these angles. Okay? So this is going to be our example, and then these are going to be our practice problems. Okay? So for this first one, we're looking at this problem here. I have an angle. Okay, so we're going to talk about the way that we can name this angle and how we would classify it. So there are 3 ways for us to name it and then 1 way for us to classify it. Okay, so one way is that we can use the vertex as the middle letter, and use a point from each side. Okay, so if I do that, and I'm going to name this angle, I'm going to use the angle symbol. So the vertex is the center, or where the 2 lines meet. So my vertex is Y. So that means that when I name it, I have to use the vertex as the center. So the Y has to go in the middle, and then I'm going to use a point from each side. So I could name this angle X, Y, Z. Y is my vertex. Or I could name it angle, we'll just go backwards, Z, Y, X. So that would be using the vertex. And if I use the vertex as the middle letter, that means I'm naming a point on each side of the vertex, and the vertex has to go in the center. Okay. Another way is that you could use only the vertex. Okay, so if I'm looking at this angle, I could name it by only using the vertex. So since the vertex is Y, I could also name this angle, angle Y, because that's my vertex. I could name it by using a number. So if I look at this angle, you'll see on the inside it has a 1. Okay, so that's angle 1. So I could name it by calling it angle 1. And then we're going to classify it. So if I'm looking at this angle and we're thinking about angle measures, what can you tell me about this angle? Well, by looking at it, we can see that it's less than 90 degrees. So what kind of angle is this? Since it's less than 90, it would be an acute angle. So those are the 4 ways that we can name the angle. Okay, and all of that goes with your example. Then these are separate. Okay, so let's work through these 4 practice problems together. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to name it, and then we're going to classify it. Okay. All right, so for my first angle, number 1, if I use the vertex, okay, I have to use it as the middle letter. So my vertex is B because that's in the middle. That's where my 2 lines meet. So I could name this angle A, B, C. I also could name it angle CBA, okay? Vertex is in the center. I could just name it by the letter of the vertex. Well, we know that our vertex is B, so I could call this angle B. Or I could name it by the number. So we have a 2 here, okay? Or I could call this angle 2. So those are the 4 names that I could call this angle. So now what we're going to do is we're going to classify it. So by looking at this angle, when we classify it by its angle measure. So if I'm looking here, what kind of angle is this? Well, we know that this symbol right here, this little square, means that it is a right angle. So if we were going to classify it, we would classify it as a right angle. And we know that right angles measure 90 degrees. Okay. All right, let's look at number 2. So we're going to name it the 4 different ways, and then we're going to classify it. So if I name it by using the vertex as the middle number, so this is going to be angle. We could name it RST because S is our vertex. That's where our 2 lines meet. Or I could name it angle TSR. Or remember that we can just name it by the vertex itself. So the vertex is S, so we could call it angle S. We could call it by the number. We could name it by the number. So since we have a 3 here, or we could call it angle 3. And then we are going to classify it by the type of angle that it is. Well, by looking at it, we can see that it's greater than 90 degrees, so that means that it is an obtuse angle. Okay, and we're not measuring anything. We're just naming it based on what type of angle it is. Okay. All right, our next one, number 3. So we're going to name it the 4 ways, and then we're going to classify it. All right, so this one does look a little bit different, okay? Most angles that you're used to seeing bend in some way, and this one is not bending. So this one is a straight line, okay? So we'll go ahead and classify it right now. And we're just going to, since it is a straight line, that means that it is a straight angle. Okay, it's a straight angle. Straight angles measure 180 degrees, and we know that a straight line is 180 degrees. Okay, so now we are going to name it the 4 different ways. So M is our vertex. That's where the 2 lines meet, the 2 rays meet. So we could call it angle LMN, since M is my vertex. Or we could call it angle NML. Or I could just name it by its vertex, so angle M. Or by the number. So since there's a 4 here, this would be angle 4. And then we've already established that it is a straight line, so that means it's a straight angle. Straight angles are straight lines, and we know that straight lines are 180 degrees. So you don't have to know the 180 degree part, but know that if it's a straight line, that means it's a straight angle. All right, and the last one. We have FGH and the number 2. Okay, so we're going to name it the 4 different ways. So we're going to start with our vertex as the middle letter. So our vertex is G. So I could call it angle FGH. We could call it angle HGF. I could call it just by the vertex, and since the vertex is G, that would be angle G. And then by the number, so since there's a 2 here, it would be angle 2. And by looking at it, I can tell that it's less than 90 degrees. So that means that it is an acute angle. Okay. All right, and the last thing that we're going to look at for classifying angles is to identify the vertical and the adjacent angles. So remember that vertical means that they are opposite, across from one another, and adjacent means that they are side by side, or they share a common vertex, a common side, and they do not overlap. Okay? All right, so if I'm looking at example 5, I have my two lines and they intersect. So my vertical angles are going to be across from one another. Doesn't matter where you start. So let's just start with angle 4 here. So angle 4, and we have to put the symbol there so we know that we have an angle. So angle 4 is vertical to what angle? What angle is across from angle 4? Or opposite? So that would be angle 2. So angle 4 and angle 2 are vertical. And then I have 1 and 3. Angle 1 and angle 3 would also be vertical. Okay, they are across from one another or opposite angles. So remember that vertical means opposite. Okay, now looking at the same example, I'm going to name the adjacent angles. Okay, so adjacent, remember that adjacent means they share a common vertex, a common side, and they do not overlap. You can also think of as adjacent meaning side by side. Okay, so if I start with angle 4, angle 4 is adjacent to angle 1. They're side by side, they share a common vertex, they share a common side. They don't overlap. Okay, angle 1 and angle 2 are adjacent. They share a common vertex, a common side, they do not overlap. Angle 2 and angle 3 are adjacent. They share a common vertex, a common side, they don't overlap. Okay? Angle 3 and angle 4 are adjacent because they share a common vertex, a common side, and they don't overlap. So those are all of our adjacent angles. Okay? All right, let's look at number 6. So number 6, we have two line segments that intersect. Okay? You'll see that this one looks a little bit different because there's nothing labeled here. So since this is not labeled, we are not going to use that part. So first thing, if I'm going to name my vertical angles, my angles across from one another, the only one that I can name is angle 3 and angle 5. Okay, because I know the name of those angles, I can name those angles. So angle 3 and angle 5 are the only vertical angles. Now, we know that 4 is vertical to this angle, but this angle doesn't have a name, so I can't identify it. So that is why I'm not listing it, okay? And then I have my adjacent angles. So remember, adjacent, side by side, they share a common vertex, a common side, and they don't overlap. So for adjacent angles, I have angle 3 is adjacent to angle 4. They share the vertex, a common side, they don't overlap. Oops, I forgot my symbol for angle 4, so angle 4. Okay, and then I have angle 4 and angle 5 are adjacent. They share a common vertex, a common side, and they do not overlap. Okay, again, I can't use this angle. It doesn't have a name, so I can't use it when I'm identifying vertical or adjacent angles. So some things to remember when classifying angles is angles can be classified by using the vertex as the middle letter and a point from each side, using only the vertex, using the number, and by angle measures is how you usually classify it. So we know that if it's a right angle, it measures 90 degrees. If it's less than 90, it's acute. If it's greater than 90, it's obtuse. And if it's 180 degrees or a straight line, that means it is a straight angle. Okay. Vertical angles are opposite angles formed by the intersection of two lines. Remember that vertical angles are also congruent. And then adjacent angles share a common vertex, a common side, and they do not overlap. Or adjacent means that they are side by side. So that is how you classify angles and how you identify vertical and adjacent angles.